Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is February the 26th, 2023, and we are here to talk about the world. I'll be joined by the amazing and powerful Agent Smith here in just a moment. Let's join the channel and see what he's got for us this week with Agent Smith.
What?
Yo.
How are you?
Doing okay. Recovering from being sick, but I'm surviving. How are you?
I can't complain. I did your walk today.
Good man.
So I got in a little exercise.
Yeah, you're going to be ripped. 20-minute walk. Do it, chat. Especially if you feel like crap.
Yeah, you gonna make it?
Am I going to make it?
Yeah, you sound pretty tired tonight.
Oh, well, I'm all congested and stuff. I think I'm over the worst part of the sickness. Friday, I was like feverish and woozy all day. So that was probably the worst of it. But I got just some kind of standard bacterial or viral thing. I'm not sure what it was, but I went to a metal show on Monday, and mosh pit is a good place to get like sweat and grossness on yourself and get sick. So I successfully got sick from that. But I'll be fine.
That always sucks.
Yeah, now I'm in the congestion and drainage phase. Bit of a sinus pressure headache, but heart of a champion, soul of a warrior, talons of an eagle. I'll be okay.
That's the spirit.
Yes, exactly. Wisdom of an owl.
Yeah,
Agility
I'm
of
much
an
less
antelope.
productive when I'm sick.
Yeah. I've been still getting some streams in. I took Friday off, and then yesterday I streamed an hour less than what I would consider my minimum, which is 8 hours, and then, yeah. We doing okay, though. It's pretty standard sickness. Nothing about it is really surprising me of like, oh my gosh, I have something serious. It's like, yep, I'm a hermit. I stay inside almost all the time, so whenever I do go outside in close proximity to a lot of people, I just need to catch up with the germ meta, you know? I was not up to date on the latest and greatest germs, but now I am.
So what was it that you got? Was it flu or just a cold?
Probably more than just a cold. I don't think you normally get a fever when you have a cold.
Gotcha.
So yeah,
And
some
did you
kind
get a
of
flu shot this year?
No. I don't usually get flu shots. I know some people are all about it.
Yeah, I never really got them much either when I was going to college, but sort of in the last couple years, I started going out of my way to do it. Because I noticed I tended to get sick generally around times when I really didn't even want to be sick, around exams and stuff like that. And so I finally threw up my hands and said, you know what, screw it. I'm just going to get the damn vaccine. And that did seem to help.
Yeah, I did get the Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine, but I haven't really gotten any flu shots at all.
Yeah, it can be a little expensive,
How much do they
relatively
cost?
speaking.
Ballpark?
It's like 50 to 100 generally, something around there. Although it probably varies depending on where you are and, your healthcare plan and that kind of stuff.
No.
At the university, they would generally do them for free, I think.
Yeah.
And sometimes they can be done for free, sort of at local clinics, if they're kind of trying to attract business, basically, trying to get people in. But other times, some of the local pharmacies will just sort of charge you maximum price. But it can be worth it. Kind of saves you a couple weeks of misery and work, for that matter.
Yeah. I don't usually get sick that often. I think this flu that I got is like the first time I've been sick in about 2 years, so I feel like I'm kind of due to be sick for a bit. It's all good. Has there anything interesting been happening this week? I think I saw Trump is running again. Did he announce that officially now?
Yeah, he announced that a while ago.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that's not a really new information per se. But yeah, he's kind of been running around. I think he went to East Palestine.
The Ohio place that got messed up.
Yeah, yeah. The big train derailment and the release of the whatchamacallit stuff, the chloride, whatever it was.
Yeah.
So he went down there and he bought he bought McDonald's for the local fire department and the police and all that kind of thing. So it was a nice little PR moment. It's a pretty obvious pandering, but it's the good kind of pandering. It's the kind of stuff that you kind of want your politicians to be doing.
McDonald's?
Yeah. Yeah. It kind of felt a little cheap coming from a billionaire, but food is food.
I don't know if he's actually a billionaire, but yeah. I would think that he would go with something a little bit more gourmet, but whatever the local people like, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, it's not a wealthy town. There's probably not a lot of gourmet options anyway.
Yeah, that's fair. Oh my gosh, speaking of small town gourmet options, my parents live in a town that has like Michelin 3 or 4 star restaurant or some crap. It's like a city that gets a whole bunch of tourism during the summer, so it actually is sustainable to have a pretty fancy restaurant there, and the chef apparently is like award winning and stuff. I've been there quite a few times. I've actually been there both as a non-vegan and as a vegan, and in both cases the food was stellar. He's just a really creative and solid chef who knows how to make a bunch of different stuff work. The menu is always rotating, and then if you just say like, hey, can you whip up something that's vegetarian or vegan, he'll be like, sure, and like make some seasonal vegetable thing that doesn't feel half-assed. It feels like it's on par with everything else. So there are some small towns that do have some super fucking good food. Check out Skogan Kitchen if you go to Custer, South Dakota. It's the city probably closest to Mount Rushmore and stuff. And even if you're not into big stone monuments and shit, there's a bunch of natural wonders and stuff in the area. The Black Hills region of South Dakota is where basically all of the beauty is in the state. Something to keep in mind. Chat was buzzing.
Go ahead.
Chat was buzzing a little bit earlier about some Air Force person saying there's a inevitable China-US war. I don't know about that. We talk about this a bunch. Have there been any different developments lately on that?
I think they're basically just talking about what we were talking about last time, which is that if China does end up sending weapons to Russia in order to help them with their war, then that's going to lead to retaliation by the United States and the West. And that retaliation could itself lead to tit-for-tat escalation, which, as we've talked about before, is dangerous and something to be avoided if possible. But I would hardly call that inevitable at this point. In fact, for the past week or so, China's kind of been walking back some of the statements they've been making about potentially sending weapons to Russia. It's not clear if they really mean it or not, but they've kind of been waffling a little bit on whether or not they're going to do it. And this, what was it, the head of the CIA came out a couple days ago, and he was saying that they do not currently have any evidence that China is going to go forward with that. So, of course, that could change, but for the moment, it seems like U.S. pressure, combined with, pressure by what American allies, seems to be sufficient thus far to prevent China from escalating its support to Russia.
What type of pressure? Just like, hey guys, you better not do that?
Thus far, it has been undisclosed just what the United States has been threatening. They haven't been open about that, but, it doesn't take a lot of guesses to kind of figure it out. I mean, for one, economic pressure, trade between the United States and China is still pretty immense. So, significant escalation in trade pressure in the form of sanctions or tariffs or what have you could be very disruptive, especially if the United States does it in a targeted way that focuses on sensitive industries for the Communist Party of China, those industries being the ones that are critical to the country sort of moving up into a more developed level, specifically industries that are important to becoming more technologically independent of producers that are thus far focused mostly in the West, the United States and Europe, Japan, etc. So we already kind of did that with companies like ZTE and Huawei. So it's quite possible for the United States to kind of go after uh, tech firms and other firms focused in more advanced industries in China and really hobble them, if not just dismantle them outright. In the case of ZTE and Huawei, that was done more through direct and indirect pressure. I mean, in the case of ZTE, it had to do with basically cutting them off from chips, or at least threatening to cut them off from chips. And when I say chips, I mean like computer chips, of course.
We're gonna cut you off potato chips. That'll teach them.
Yeah, and then with Huawei, it had more to do with indirect pressure. I mean, there was a lot of things the U.S. did to pressure Huawei, including threatening and curtailing their access to chips, and but more importantly was cutting them off from access to the Google, what was it, the Google Store, the app. There's a lot of applications on there that are just sort of the norm, right? Everybody wants access to those. And, when Huawei lost access to them, their smartphones basically saw a collapse in demand. If you can't get those applications, there's not a lot of reason to get the phone, especially when there are competitors that retain access to the Google Store. Mm. Or maybe it was the Apple Store, I don't remember. Basically cut off from just Western applications in general. So pressure like that could be applied again, targeting other Chinese tech firms, or even just industrial firms that have a critical critical roles in supply chains in China. So all of that is possible. That's one form of retaliation Washington could take. And also, another form of retaliation could have to do with Taiwan. We could, for example, announce a big arms sale, have more politicians travel there. I don't really think that's all that big a deal, but, it's the symbolic things that could be done which would rile Beijing. But more substantively would be things like arms sales, military cooperation, officer exchanges, training regimes, that kind of stuff. And of course, we could always just, if we wanted to be real assholes, we could just sail a carrier battle group through the Taiwan Strait. We haven't done that in a hot minute. I think the last time was in the mid-90s during the last Taiwan crisis. But hypothetically, we could do it again, just to kind of thumb our noses. And the party, that's not really a threat to the party per se. I mean, they're not going to get overthrown because of that, but it is embarrassing for them. Especially in a region that's right next to their coastline. So I don't know exactly what they would do in retaliation for such actions, but it definitely would force them into a position where they would have to choose between a lot of negative options. Because whatever they did to escalate beyond that point, the United States would probably be able to retaliate in kind. Well, not only in kind, but possibly also disproportionately. Basically, the more China does in retaliation to American escalations, the less room they have to maneuver. The United States has what's called escalatory dominance, basically. If it goes to the mat, right, if we just continue on escalating tit for tat, the United States can ultimately bring more pain on China than the reverse. Mm-hmm. I mean, at the extreme, we could just cut them off from the Straits of Malacca, if not also the South China Sea, if not also just implicitly blockading their ports. Mm-hmm. So that's an extreme example, but that's not something that they can do to the U.S., at least not right now. So that gives the United States an advantage in the broader the broader pattern of escalation that could emerge. Mm-hmm. And so that does give the United States some leverage in that regard. Nobody wants it to get to that point, but that does serve as a deterrent to Beijing kind of taking this process of escalations to the next level if the United States did impose some kind of punishment for Chinese support to Russia. And so that's why I'm arguing here that China probably at this point is not going to give that aid, at least not as of yet. So that's why I don't think that the questioner is quite correct in saying that a war is inevitable. I don't think Beijing wants a war. They've got their own problems right now. They're still kind of trying to unwind the issues putting it mildly, in their financial sector and in their real estate sector.
Mm.
That's much more important to the stability of the Chinese economy and by extension the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And the party cares a lot more about its legitimacy than it does about shenanigans going on in Europe or what have you.
True.
Yeah, China's perspective on the war in Ukraine is basically not that different from the perspective in the developing world generally, which is that it's not their problem. It's a European war between European states, and it's pretty much almost exclusively a regional war, in the sense that it does not really have broader ramifications. It's definitely had broader economic ramifications, but not much else besides. It's not drawing in, countries from all over the world, to come fight on behalf of one or the other party. So given that it's a regional phenomenon, other states and other parts of the world are largely just staying out of it. In so much as they're giving support, it's largely token, with few exceptions. I think Japan has given more substantive support to Ukraine, but there's not a lot of other examples besides of countries outside Europe doing that.
What are the laws about sailing in the Taiwan Strait? Like, who owns that? Is that just something that we can do, but it's rude? Or is it against the law?
Well, if you talk to people in China, they would argue that Taiwan belongs to China. So if that's the case, then the Taiwan Strait is definitely well within China's own national waters. So from the Chinese perspective, whenever the United States sails any vessels through the Taiwan Strait, then we're straight up violating their sovereignty. Those are sovereign Chinese waters, and we're very much sailing through them without permission.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, pretty confrontational to do that, regardless of circumstances. The United States has gotten away with it in the past because, of course, we don't really fully recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. Technically, we kind of do. We sort of have this weird in-between policy where we agree that Taiwan is part of China, but then we oppose forcible reunification.
Mm-hmm.
So that creates a kind of gray area where it's not entirely clear just what position Washington has on it. And really, strategic ambiguity has kind of been part and parcel of America's Taiwan policy since the 1980s or so. So it's purposely ambiguous in that sense. But nominally, we more or less work with the Taiwan government as if it were de facto independent, even if Washington would never say as much. So in that sense, the Taiwan Straits, well, sovereignty over the Taiwan Strait is more debatable. If Taiwan is an independent state, then they would get about half of it, roughly. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, we're not necessarily violating China's sovereignty in that sense. But of course, if China conceded that we were not violating their sovereignty by sailing through the Taiwan Strait, they would be implicitly agreeing that Taiwan were not part of China. And of course, they're never going to do that.
Right.
So whether or not it's legal, quote unquote, for the United States to sail through the Taiwan Strait really depends on your perspective. From Taiwan's perspective, it's totally fine. For them, it's their waters and they don't have an issue with the US doing it. From China's perspective, totally illegal, violation of their sovereignty, very confrontational. And then from America's perspective, we purposely do not have a position on the legality. We choose not to have an opinion on it specifically so that we can remain non-committal as to our position on the status of Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's kind of a gray area in that sense. So the real answer there is it depends.
It depends. A very common yet unsatisfying answer.
Well, it's unsatisfying to China. It works out pretty well for America and Taiwan. We're pretty content with that status. Let's see, did you see the big peace plan that China released for the Ukraine war?
No, what's that?
It's a 12-point peace proposal that Beijing released. And nominally, it's supposed to be a kind of guidepost for how to achieve some kind of negotiated peaceful resolution to the conflict. In practice, it doesn't really do anything of the sort. Reading through it, I did not get the impression that it was all that serious a document. There's some nice things in it. It's not contemptible per se, but it lacks any real details about how to actually move towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So really, it's more about posturing. China is trying here to posture itself as a neutral arbiter in order to kind of bolster its image, so to speak, because that's about all they can do. I mean, unless they're going to jump into the conflict with material support to Russia beyond, much far beyond what they're giving thus far, or unless they want to start pressuring Russia, the only other thing they can do is kind of engage in these sorts of rhetorical flourishes, like peace proposals that don't really go anywhere. So to give you an idea of what's in, the proposal, most of the items, again, it's 12 items, most of them are basically just appeals to good behavior. What was it? Items 1 and 6 here, I have in my notes. Items 1 and 6 are basically just asking the combatants to respect international law. Specifically, they're asking for the sovereignty of all countries to be respected, and also for civilians and prisoners of war to be treated according to international law. So, that's great, but obviously that's not really happening in the conflict. And unless they want to offer some kind of stick or, incentive to try to get the actors involved to kind of behave better in that regard, especially Russia, it's kind of cheap talk. It doesn't really mean anything.
Mm.
They did make an appeal to humanitarian aid. They did ask for efforts to be made by not only countries involved in the conflict, but also other countries to try to do everything they could to relieve the humanitarian crisis in the war. That's nice, but it's not really clear what that would have to do with any kind of peace negotiations. So again, nice things, but don't really actually lay the groundwork for much. Probably the most interesting part of the document was the stuff they had on nuclear, specifically nuclear energy and weapons. As far as nuclear energy, they basically just asked both combatants to not attack nuclear infrastructure, which is, kind of a no-brainer. Nobody wants that. But more interestingly, they specifically said that they rejected the use of any nuclear weapons in the conflict. So that's kind of notable because, of course, the Russian government has been sort of implicitly on the sly threatening possible use of nuclear weapons pretty much since the war started, if not before. So it seems like Beijing is very much not on board with that. The rest of the document is kind of ambiguous as to how China really perceives Russia's war in Ukraine. But on this one point, they seem to be very much coming out against Russia.
Mm.
Now, again, condemning use of nuclear weapons is not a high bar. That's something like most countries could agree with. And it may be that even if Russia did use them, that Beijing wouldn't really care or actually do much. So in that sense, this again may be more about just posturing and trying to sort of build China's reputation as neutral arbiter here.
Mm-hmm.
But that's speculation on my part. Regardless, it was an interesting point just because it contradicted Russia a little bit. And then there was a couple economics points as well. Points 9 and 12 had to do with, one, encouraging both sides to continue to respect the grain deal that they had signed early in the conflict. And then were also trying to promote post-conflict reconstruction, which they, somewhat self-interestedly noted that China could play a particular role in. Beijing never misses an opportunity to kind of jump in and bolster its industrial policy. That's what a lot of Chinese economic diplomacy has basically really been about over the past 10 to 15 years or so. So, again, just to kind of summarize these particular points, these are all basically just appeals to good behavior and trying to kind of plot out, in the case of reconstruction, something that could be done after the war. But again, none of this stuff really has to do with actually managing peace negotiations. Also, there were 4 separate points that were basically just pure-blooded posturing, and that posturing had to do with criticizing the West. So for one, they encouraged, nobody in particular, but pretty clear they were targeting the West here, they encouraged the abandonment of Cold War mentality, which may sound strange, but this is actually a phrase, Cold War mentality, that China has used a lot over the past 20 some years. And they generally use it with regard to the United States, specifically whenever the US government criticizes something that China is doing or tries to pressure China over some item of disagreement, like the trade war, for example. Generally, the Chinese government will respond to that by accusing the United States of having a quote unquote Cold War mentality and of trying to start another Cold War with China. So here, they are once again accusing the United States in particular, if not the West generally, of approaching the conflict with a quote unquote Cold War mentality. They're also basically asking all outside powers not involved in the conflict to stop sending aid. They're implicitly arguing with point 3 that this is just exacerbating the conflict. And in point 10, they ask outside, non-combatants that are not involved in the conflict to stop unilateral sanctions, which again is a dig at the West, since obviously we're the main ones doing that. And they also made an appeal to keep industrial and supply chains stable. And as part of this point, they make the argument that no country should weaponize free trade, and that all countries should respect the international order, specifically the World Economic Order. So again, that's basically another dig at the United States in particular for using sanctions in order to go after countries that it has disagreements with. So 4 points there, basically not about the peace process per se, but just more about critiquing the West, either explicitly or implicitly. And so the only real point that actually has to do with peace talks was point 4, which was the only substantive point out of the 12, and that just basically called for both sides to start up dialogue. Which, yeah, that's great, but they don't really outline any pathway to do that or what they should be talking about or anything else. It's just call for dialogue. So that's effectively what China's peace plan is here.
You guys should talk and figure it out. We're not going to tell you how to do that, but we know that you should. And also you should stop fighting and also stop spending money on the fighting. And stop asking people for money on the fighting. Why stop there? Why not make even more strict rules? Like, okay, stop using firearms. You can only punch your opponents.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to work.
Or do the Himalayan mountain fighting style of you may use swords.
There you go. I think overall, though, the West will take this. Not in the sense that it's going to support the peace plan, but, if China limits its involvement in the conflict to just empty gestures like this, I think the West will be pretty happy with that. The main concern is actual lethal support to Russia. So long as China refrains from that, probably the West isn't going to care a whole lot about what Beijing does vis-a-vis the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Guess we could talk about Ukraine a little bit. We don't have a whole lot of new items here. We can just kind of quickly do the update.
Sure.
Did we talk last time about Joe Biden traveling to Ukraine?
I don't think so. I do remember seeing that in the news, though.
Yeah. His original agenda was just to travel to Poland.
Mm-hmm.
But they apparently carved out some time to actually go to, Ukraine itself and Kiev, actually. He could have gone to, like, Western Ukraine, but he actually went out of his way to go to Kiev specifically, to meet with President Zelensky.
Mm-hmm.
So, it was a nice gesture for the United States. Some Ukraine boosters were probably reading too much into it. It certainly is kind of a snub to Russia, since, Ukraine at this point is sufficiently safe for the President of the United States to travel there. And certainly, Russia was not really asked whether or not it could happen. Basically the United States told them, this is a thing we're going to do. And if you try to stop us, then there's going to be consequences. So, Russia was notified ahead of time. Probably not very far ahead of time, but I did read that they were notified and implicitly told to basically mind their manners, effectively.
Mm.
I think Russia did retaliate by pulling out of the New START agreement. Maybe they were planning on doing it anyway, but I thought it was notable that they announced it in the days immediately after Biden's trip to Kiev.
What's the New START agreement again?
That's an agreement that's about 10 years old, roughly, in which Russia and the United States had agreed to limit the number of nuclear weapons that each side had. It was basically the latest in a long line of arms agreements between Russia and the United States that were attempting to restrict the size of their respective nuclear arsenals. In general, it would be best to have a minimal number of nuclear weapons because that minimizes the probability that there's an accident or that in general they just get used. So the United States and Russia over the past half century or so have been negotiating successive agreements to reduce the size of those arsenals, more or less in lockstep. I thought it was notable that Putin came out and said, as part of his announcement that Russia was pulling out of New START, that the decision was reversible. So, this is not a final decision per se. They are leaving the door open for a return to the agreement. So this seems to be not so much a permanent, state of affairs. It's not Russia announcing that they're going to significantly increase the size of their arsenal. They're just saying that if the United States does not, give them what they want, effectively, does not recognize Russian security concerns in the region, as they would say, then there is possibility of nuclear escalation in terms of the size of arsenals, not usage of nuclear weapons. So that's not really going to go anywhere. I don't think anybody in the West is going to change their approach to Ukraine just because of that. And, by saying that the decision is reversible, the Russian government is implicitly recognizing that it has good incentive, to join the agreement and that they probably will return to the agreement later on after the war in Ukraine has been resolved. Yeah, there was also an announcement out of Moscow that what was it? Putin had signed a decree putting new ground-based strategic complexes on combat standby duty, quote unquote. So supposedly, well, not supposedly, he actually said that Russia was ready to resume nuclear weapons testing, which is, what that announcement was about. But he also quickly followed that statement up by saying that Russia would not do it first. Rather, he said that if the United States started conducting nuclear tests, then Russia would follow it up in response. So again, it's kind of a non-announcement. He's saying that, we're going to do a thing that could open the door to us resuming nuclear testing, but oh, by the way, we're not going to do it unless you do it first. So, these sound like threats, but really not so much. Again, I think this is just down to the Russian government wanting to do something in retaliation to the Biden visit, but not wanting to do anything too dramatic. So probably, like a lot of things the Russian government does, it was done mostly for domestic political consumption within Russia, and not so much, as a signal, to the West as far as diplomatic relations and intentions. Oh, I thought this was an interesting note too. This kind of goes back to China. Apparently, the Chinese government was planning on sending lethal support to Russia last year in 2022. This is a report, well, not a report, but an article released by Der Spiegel. So a Der Spiegel reporter said that they found evidence that, or had heard from sources that there's evidence that China was planning to do that. Specifically, they said that China was planning on sending loitering munitions, about 100 or so. No, wait, no, this is this year. So the loitering munitions were this year. Last year, it was aircraft parts, specifically for a Sukhoi aircraft that Russia has. So it's not immediately clear why China did not end up doing that. I think there was similar non-lethal support that they ended up sending later on. So, maybe they did end up sending the parts, but apparently they were planning much broader support to Russia, but did not follow up. So again, not clear why they did that. It could be because of U.S. pressure, or it could be just a strategic decision on the part of Beijing. But it's worth noting that that was something that they were planning to do, but decided not to. So, there is something going on in Beijing which is inhibiting their support to Russia, and has apparently been since the war started. See, so I think the other item I had here had to do with some new sanctions targeting Russia. These are basically just to do with trying to stop Russian efforts to circumvent sanctions. The Russians have been using smuggling networks and shell corporations and all manner of shenanigans of one kind or another to try to use third-party countries as sites through which they can continue to import strategic goods that they need for their war effort. And so there's been a relatively steady drumbeat of sanctions announcements coming out of the Treasury Department here in the United States, announcing new individuals and companies that are being targeted as part of a concerted effort to try to stop, or at least inhibit, more accurately, the Russian effort to circumvent those sanctions. So there's about 100 entities that were announced as part of the latest sanctions in that vein. It's quite a few. And that's probably going to be a recurring theme in 2023 as well.
We'll sanction them. Well, then we'll just do shenanigans. Well, then we'll sanction your shenanigans. Well, then we'll make new shenanigans. And so it goes.
It sounds goofy, but that's actually exactly what's happening. It's just going to be an on-running battle. And Russia, being a relatively large country, is probably going to be better able to do that than some of the smaller countries like Venezuela and Cuba that have been trying to do that over the past couple decades. Although I did hear a countervailing opinion recently. I don't remember what article I was reading, but there was an analyst that was saying that Russia may actually find it harder to engage in this kind of sanctions busting than, say, Iran or Cuba. So, Iran and Cuba don't have nearly the resources of Russia, which might make you intuitively think that they would be less capable of sanctions busting than Russia. But the advantage that they have is that, being smaller countries, their needs are much smaller. The stuff that they're trying to smuggle is much smaller in quantity. And so that means that their smuggling efforts are much more low profile. It's much easier to smuggle in lower quantities of stuff than larger quantities of stuff. And of course, Russia is trying to smuggle in very large quantities of material of one kind or another. So even though they have much more human capital, much more money to work with, much more extensive experience in intelligence operations, at the same time, just the sheer scale of the operations they're going to have to engage in to circumvent all these sanctions will make those efforts relatively high profile and, by extension, easier for intelligence agencies and opposing governments to stop. So that is a big disadvantage there on the part of the Russians as far as sanctions busting on their part. So something to keep in mind. It may not be that they're as successful as people may have expected, given that fact. Let's see, there was also a new tranche of aid released to Ukraine. I didn't get the number that was associated with that, but basically, I thought it was notable that the U.S. is going to start giving electrical grid equipment to Ukraine. For obvious reasons, Russia's obviously been attacking Ukraine's electrical grid. And also, they're going to give power generators, which, of course, people in Ukraine have been using a lot of as a result of the power frequently being out on account of attacks on the electrical grid. So, that's a nice gesture from the United States. I kind of thought we were already doing that, but I guess not. So hopefully that is useful as far as propping up the electrical grid there. I would add here as a side note that ensuring, a ready supply of electricity in Ukraine is not only useful as a humanitarian objective, it's also useful in order to try to boost the Ukrainian economy as much as possible. Specifically, one of, if not the main reason Russia is attacking the electrical grid is to undermine Ukraine's economy and, by extension, their ability to continue to pay for all of the aid that they're getting, from the United States and Western allies. Not all of it is just free. A lot of it has to be paid for, or at least has to be paid for by loan. So, the more of that stuff that Ukraine can pay for with its own money, the better for their finances. And so Russia is implicitly undermining that effort by trying to target the Ukrainian economy writ large and, by extension, the tax revenue that Kiev is getting from it. So if the United States can undermine that effort by Russia by bolstering the supply of electricity, that puts the Ukrainians in a better position. Also, more economic growth, more jobs for people, more money for individuals, which helps make the population more resilient to, all of the things happening, the disruptions from the war, unemployment, etc. It doesn't get reported on a whole lot, but Ukraine's economy is definitely hurting. So whatever the West can do to help prop them up is definitely helpful in that regard. Probably the main economic aid that the West is giving is not actually monetary in nature. Rather, it's the hosting of Ukrainian refugees. There's, several million refugees that have come out of Ukraine and are being hosted by countries like Poland and Germany. Poland especially is hosting a lot. And generally, host governments have been pretty generous with the terms of the hosting, much more so than other groups, especially from places like the Middle East and Africa. I'm sure everybody remembers the immigration crisis mid-decade, last decade, and all the drama around that. This time, much less drama. In general, they're allowed to work, they're allowed to attend educational institutions. They even frequently have access to social benefits of one kind or another. So the terms of the refugees from Ukraine are very favorable compared to refugees from other parts of the world. So, you can kind of argue about the equity of that. Obviously, there's some criticism perhaps that could be made there, but in general, it's definitely very beneficial to Ukraine. Those people who are working in Europe can send remittances back to family in Ukraine, and that can help serve to prop up the economy. It also serves to help educate, Ukrainian children, which can help improve human capital in Ukraine. Also, there's a big benefit in terms of the opportunity cost. If they had been forced to stay in Ukraine, a lot of children would not be getting education right now on account of the dislocation and the lack of resources available to the Ukrainian government. Obviously, Kiev is shoveling a lot of their resources into the war effort, and so that's inherently meant cuts in other areas. So, big bonus there in terms of education not being missed, which would be the case otherwise. So all of that is a huge boon, for the Ukrainian economy and for the finances of the Ukrainian government. But of course, there is also monetary aid. The West is also sending financial aid packages, is giving relatively favorable loans to Ukraine so that they can buy the weapons and equipment and other supplies that they need. So indirect supports like that are also happening. Well, direct monetary supports like that are happening, and they are useful. And of course, all of the military aid itself is very useful as well. Ukraine does have to pay for a lot of that one way or the other, but it's being done on relatively favorable terms, and some of it is actually free. The West is, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, the United States government is actually paying for Ukraine's access to Starlink, for example. Mm-hmm. So, there is some free stuff that is part of the aid package in that sense.
I saw that Saudi Arabia was gonna dedicate like 400 mil to Ukraine.
I had not heard that. That's actually kind of surprising. I would not think Riyadh would be that interested.
I don't know. Just saw the headline today. I didn't read all of it.
I'll have to look into that. That's actually pretty interesting.
Yeah.
That could be MBS trying to play nice with Washington. That would certainly be an interesting signal. Because the general trend over the past 10 years has been more Saudi cooperation with Russia rather than the opposite. And, I don't know if you've read about OPEC lately, but in general, nobody talks about OPEC anymore. What they do talk about is OPEC plus, which is basically OPEC plus Russia. Russia is not a formal member of OPEC, but they've actually started coordinating oil production decisions together, more and more so over the past 10 years. So in general, Saudi Arabia's relationship correspondingly, with Russia has been getting better. And there's been more cooperation on that count. So if the Saudis are giving aid to Ukraine now, that would suggest some kind of reversal there and potentially a restoration of ties between Washington and Riyadh, which, famously have been on the rocks for several years now. So interesting tidbit. Thank you. Mm-hmm. I had not seen that. As far as aid to Ukraine, I would also point out that I was looking this up today. Ukraine's GDP, I think it was in 2019, before the pandemic, was around $200 billion. Mm-hmm. And the amount of total aid that the United States has sent to Ukraine thus far is about $100 billion. So the total amount of aid the United States has supplied to Ukraine since the war started is equivalent to 50% of Ukraine's 2019 GDP.
Damn.
Yeah, it's pretty significant. They would almost certainly not have been able to afford all that otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, it would have been just way beyond their means. And I would point out too that 2019 GDP is almost certainly higher than current GDP. You know, the pandemic would have done damage significantly so in 2020, obviously. And 2021 brought a lot of pressure from, Russia, inflation, natural gas prices, et cetera. And of course, in 2022, the invasion happened and did significant damage to the economy. So probably total American aid thus far is much higher than 50% of GDP at this juncture, I would expect. And of course, if you throw in, aid from other countries like Europe, Japan, et cetera, the total military aid to Ukraine significantly higher than 50% of GDP. Maybe even approaching around 75 or so. I haven't seen the numbers on aid from everyone else. Military aid from Europe is much less than U.S. aid. So it's not necessarily a big jump once you add on European aid. That's not a dig at Europe, by the way. I recognize that, like I was mentioning before, Europe has given a lot of support to Ukraine, mostly in the form of hosting refugees and in terms of financial aid. There's some room for criticism in terms of military aid. They could probably be doing more, especially in a case like Germany. But criticizing them on that count does not mean that they're not giving a lot of support in other areas. But just in terms of military support, yeah, the U.S. is easily, top of the list. But yeah, it's just a lot of aid relative to GDP. And it just kind of exemplifies how important that foreign support is to the Ukrainian war effort. Oh, also, it's worth mentioning that in the latest aid package that the United States sent out, they actually did reserve some stuff for Moldova. So they're actually giving Moldova about $300 million to help them increase local power generation. And that's basically designed to make Moldova somewhat less dependent on Russian natural gas. Natural gas is one of the main tools that Moscow uses to influence Moldovan politics. So if they could become a little bit more energy independent, that would somewhat curtail Russian influence there and kind of help them out there. I would point out, too, that the Moldovan government is still talking about Russian efforts to try to overthrow the government and try to install some kind of new pro-Russian government. Nothing has happened on that count yet, but that is something that they're still sort of squawking about. Let's see. Other than that, I just had some interesting statistics. So, just this kind of rounds out the Ukraine update for today. So let's see. This is from an article that I read in The Economist. I just kind of took some of the more interesting tidbits here, and I'm going to kind of share them with you. I think most people are interested in general, the conflict in Ukraine and some of the industrial and economic aspects of it, especially with this audience. So hopefully not too boring for everybody. So one item here, the US and Europe last year altogether made enough 150 millimeter artillery shells for about 3 months of consumption, as far as Ukrainian artillery shell consumption, specifically 155 millimeter. So altogether, the US and Europe last year produced 480,000 shells. So again, Ukraine uses about that many, 155 millimeter shells specifically. So again, Ukraine uses about that many in 3 months, or at least that's been the pace thus far. Quite a bit. The European Union and the United States, for that matter, are making a lot of efforts to increase production of shells. We've talked about this before. I thought it was notable that the European Union has actually set up a joint fund to increase shell production amongst member states. We also talked about how the United States and Europe, for that matter, are shifting to faster and more multi-year contracts on shells, as well as just defense procurement generally in response to the war in Ukraine, in order to try to encourage the private sector to speed up production. It's worth repeating here. We've talked about it before, but in general, the defense sector has been a little slow to respond to increases in demand related to the Ukraine war. And that's because they don't want to get burned if the war ends sooner than expected. So multi-year contracts, as well as just speeding up the process of issuing contracts, is very helpful in that regard. The U.S. is expanding production of 155 millimeter shells somewhere between 3 to 6 times current production levels. It's going to get up to around 1 million shells a year. And I thought this was interesting. Two new factories are being set up to produce these shells, one of them in Texas, which, not a surprise, but another one in Canada, which I thought was interesting. I haven't read anything about why Canada was selected. I mean, there's not really any reason not to, but I was kind of curious if there was any particular reason Canada was an attractive site for that investment. Also worth noting, these investments in 155 millimeter shell production are not going to really be ready until somewhere between 2024 to 2028, which is a long time, but I think the fact that the US is willing to make those investments kind of betrays, well, maybe not betrays, but reveals the fact that Washington now thinks the war is going to last for a number of years. That's not the only reason. Also, it's just a positive signal to Ukraine that we're going to continue support, and a signal to Russia that the US is actually committed and that our commitment is not short-term in nature or otherwise conditional. It's unconditional support for the long term. So a positive signal in that sense. But I think realistically, the war is going to last a long time. And so that's part of the justification there. Europe is also, Europe is escalating production, Czech manufacturers, Norwegian manufacturers, etc. So runs the gamut. I think it's notable that Eastern European manufacturers in particular are the ones who seem to be ramping up the most. Some other interesting stats here. Ukraine has used 8,500 Javelin anti-tank missiles since the war started. And it's going to take, given current levels of production, 7 years for the United States to replace that. In the case of Stinger missiles, it'll take the United States about 6 years to replace the number of Stingers that the United States has shared with Ukraine and which have subsequently been used. So obviously, inventory is kind of running out pretty quickly in that regard. Just gives you an example of just how high-paced, of the pace of the conflict. I would point out as a side note here, too, the fact that inventories are they're not running out yet, but, the pace is unsustainable given current levels of production. So what's going to happen in both Ukraine and Russia is that both combatants are going to start using less munitions. Unless China jumps in and starts offering significant artillery support to Russia, most likely they're going to face similar munitions constraints as Ukraine. And so that could actually result in less usage of things like artillery, missiles, etc., as the conflict continues.
What would they do
and
instead?
That could have, sorry, what?
What would they do instead?
Well, that's the interesting part. If the Russians have been leaning very hard on their artillery thus far in the conflict. So presumably, if they could not use it as much, they would have to lean more on their other advantage, which is quantity. So you could actually see higher casualties if supplies of artillery munitions do actually fall. You could see higher casualties incurred by the Russians as they become more dependent on, I don't want to say human wave attacks per se. I don't think they've been reduced to that just yet, but they could use more infantry-centric tactics, shall we say, if they don't have things like artillery or other force multipliers to lean on as much. And to be fair, Ukraine may be pushed into a similar position. We don't talk that, well, I mean, not we per se, but the media in general, especially in the West, doesn't talk a lot about Ukrainian casualties or shortages, but they're in a similar boat, and casualties are probably not too far off of 1-to-1. That is to say, Ukraine probably has not suffered they have probably not suffered dramatically fewer casualties than the Russians. The Russians have probably been racking up, their own casualties relative to Ukraine just because of the Battle of Bakhmut and the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group has basically just been chucking people at Ukrainian positions in, Bakhmut. So there probably is higher Russian casualties at this point. But that had not really quite been the pattern before then. Before then it had seemed closer to 1-to-1. And if that pattern continues to hold, that does give the Russians some advantage, just because they do have more manpower available over the long term. They're going to have a lot of trouble mobilizing that. We've talked about that before. Even if the Russians do have a quantitative advantage, their ability to actually leverage that is somewhat limited by the fact that they have experienced a great deal of trouble actually equipping and supplying the people that they have mobilized, which inherently puts a cap on the number of people that they can mobilize within a given time frame. So yes, they have more people, but they can't really mobilize very many of them in a short period of time, and that somewhat limits the advantage. And it gives the Ukrainians greater time to try to match that to some degree, either with volunteers or by mobilizing more of their own people. This is something else that hasn't been talked about as much, but Ukraine has also experienced difficulties mobilizing its population. So, even though they've got 50 some million people, mobilization has been relatively slow because it's taken them, time to try to secure the equipment, supplies, et cetera, that is needed to actually get those people into fighting shape. So the advantage that Ukraine has vis-a-vis mobilization is not that they're better at it, but it's more so that they started earlier and that they've had a lot of help from Western partners in order to try to funnel supplies in to help them do it faster. But yeah, going back to the artillery, if there is going to be a shortage faced by both sides in munitions, you could see greater dependence on things like infantry, as well as what little armor, both sides have. I would point out that in terms of armor, Ukraine actually has something of a long-term advantage, just because Russian equipment is not really getting better over time. There are reports that they're relying more and more on older equipment from their inventory, stuff from the 60s and 50s, where before they were using stuff from the 70s and 80s. They do have some stuff from the 90s and aughts, but there's not very much of that at this point, and it's not clear how much was lost in the early stages of the war. Ukraine, in contrast, used similar equipment to Russia, and they have lost a lot of armored vehicles and whatnot since the war started, but of course, the West has been helping with that. They've announced that they're going to start sending, this, that, or the other infantry fighting vehicle or tank or what have you. So even if there's, and of course, we've been sending a lot of Soviet equipment from Eastern European countries to try to help the Ukrainians replace lost equipment. So that's probably been the larger source of new equipment thus far. So in the long term, it would seem that Ukrainian equipment is going to get more modern, whereas Russian equipment is going to get less modern, which presumably will confer some advantage. But overall, it's probably the war's pace is going to slow down and become more about infantry over time, if not also drones, which are relatively cheap and abundant. And that could mean that could translate to higher casualties. But if combat does become more dependent, if actual changes in the front line becomes more dependent on armor, Ukraine could conceivably see an advantage there, depending on how things shake out. I would point out, though, that any significant advantage in the quality, not only of Ukrainian equipment in their armored formations, but also in terms of the training and whatnot, that's going to take a while, right? Actually training Ukrainian armored formations up to a Western standard, getting them fully equipped and trained and whatnot, getting officers in position where they can lead them effectively. That's the kind of thing that normally takes years. You can kind of rush it. I don't doubt that the Ukrainians are trying to do that, but even if you rush it, it's probably going to take like a year or two. So, Ukraine boosters probably have visions of, fully decked out, westernized Ukrainian armored divisions just rolling across the plains of Ukraine and just blowing through Russian defensive positions. Assuming that ever happens at all, or that it's even feasible, it's not going to happen for several years, probably. So in the meantime, they do have some advantage from Western equipment being supplied, but it's probably not going to be a decisive advantage for a while yet, which is another reason to think the conflict is going to yet last for a long time. Let's see, there was a couple other items here. Oh yeah, bottlenecks. So, even though the West has a much bigger industrial base than Russia, there are issues that have been faced as the West has tried to scale up production. There's a lot of bottlenecks in production, specifically with regard to older equipment like Stinger missiles and to a lesser degree Javelin missiles. The factories that produced them had actually been shut down. And so that means that if we're going to increase production, we basically have to start from scratch, which inherently takes a lot of time and money. Sorry.
Okay.
Other bottlenecks include stuff like labor. Obviously, the American labor market is famously tight right now. That creates problems if you want to significantly scale up production quickly, because it means that it's going to take a while to get all of the workers you need. So that's inherently a friction there. Some other issues, some other bottlenecks include things like semiconductors. There's not really a semiconductor shortage anymore per se, but the issue is more that the semiconductors and chips and whatnot needed for advanced munitions are very specialized. And it's not like you can kind of get them anywhere. Let's see, tools, just things like machine tools, specialized machine tools used to produce the weapons and equipment needed. Those are not always readily available either. So, if you want to scale up production, you got to get those. That can be a difficult, prolonged process, especially if the tools are not in production anymore. That kind of brings me back to the fact that the factories for the Stinger missiles were shut down. In some cases, the factories for missiles and whatnot or other equipment are still active, but you can't really scale up production quickly because the factories that produce the capital equipment for those factories are themselves no longer online. And then there's also things like subcomponents. One of the issues, especially for things like guided munitions, is the fact that they're just inherently complicated. They have a lot of different parts, and that creates a lot of potential. Each of those parts basically represents a potential choke point. And so there's just the sheer number of subcomponents itself becomes an issue. Because even if you're only missing a couple, that slows down production just right there.
You're talking about
until you can
submarine
sort it out.
components?
No, just like individual components that are used to make things like rockets, missiles, etc., just weapons in general. Those are called subcomponents. Well, I mean, more specifically, the components you need to make the components that are inputs into the final product.
Oh.
Yeah, the supply chain, the more complex the product, the more extensive the supply chain gets. If you have a complex component, that component itself has its own supply chain. And so the subcomponents refers to the components that are a part of that component supply chain. So if you have issues with any of those subcomponents, then you have issues for the final product. So all of the supply chain snags for each of those individual subcomponents have to be sorted out as well. And given the sheer number of them, it invariably becomes very complicated. So that's also acted as a drag on the expansion of production. Some of the specific bottlenecks that I've read have included explosives, chips, computer chips and whatnot, rocket motors, rocket propellant, and again, just the sheer scale, of subcomponents and the supply chains involved. So obviously, rocket propellant and rocket motors are important to the production of things like missiles, loitering munitions to a lesser degree, depending on the design, rockets, etc. The article also talked a little bit about Russia. Russia's arms industry faces similar constraints, maybe even greater constraints, given how ignored and corrupt it had been. The Russian government did not really do a great job of trying to keep it up to date. To their credit, the Russian arms industry is effectively on a total war footing, which is very much not the case for Western industry. So, while the Russian arms industry has a smaller industrial base to work with, the Russian government has done a better job with mobilizing it. So they're getting more mileage out of it right now than the West is getting out of its arms industry. Let's see, I think that's about all for the Ukraine update this time.
I think we did have a question that was related to Ukraine.
Oh, okay. Is that in the...
Yeah.
Just older stuff. I think we already kind of talked about that.
Oh, it might not have been added. Let me see.
Yeah, I don't think it was added, if it was just from today.
What does Smith think about the leaked documents about Russia's alleged plan to take over Belarus in the near future?
Oh yeah, that was a thing. I don't really read too much into it. I mean, Lukashenko is smarter than he acts. Lukashenko is the dictator of Belarus. And, there's an analyst named Kamil Galiyev. At least I think that's his name. I think I've mixed up the letters of his names a couple of times, but he's talked a lot about Lukashenko and Belarus, and he's pretty crafty. He's very much a savvy political operator. And Russia has wanted to try to integrate with Belarus for some time. Belarus has actually wanted that at separate times as well, but more so because Lukashenko thought that there was an outside chance he could actually possibly become president of the unified Russian-Belarusian Federation, which was not particularly likely, but, again, he's an ambitious, smart guy. That's kind of what he was trying to maneuver himself into a position to do. Lately, the Russian government is putting a lot of pressure on Belarus to try to integrate more. So that much is true. But at the same time, Lukashenko has been very adept at deflecting that pressure, even in spite of the fact that Belarus was very much dependent on Russian support to try to suppress the mass protests that broke out in 2020 after the Belarusian government pretended to hold a presidential election that everybody knew was fraudulent. So, that kind of pushed Belarus more towards Russia and the Russian camp, so to speak. But even so, the Belarusian government pretty much limited its concessions to allowing Russia to use Belarus as a launchpad for part of its invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Since then, the Russian government has really been laying into the Belarusian government, well, not laying into per se, but pressuring the Belarusian government to participate in the war. They want the Belarusian army to help them, and they also want to continue to use the Belarusian territory as a launching pad for operations against Ukraine. And Belarus has basically not said no, but at the same time, the Belarusian government keeps finding little excuses not to do those things. And they've been doing it consistently since the war started for the past year. So at this point, nobody can be under any delusion that the Belarusian government wants to participate in the war. It's pretty clear at this point that they're just not going to do that. It had been something that Ukraine watchers had been following. The Institute for the Study of War, for example, had pretty regular updates about, what Belarus was doing and, whether or not they would jump into the conflict. And the last Institute for the Study of War report I read on Ukraine actually said that they were going to stop covering Belarus because they believed at this point that there was no real prospect for Belarusian involvement. So the fact that Belarus is actually successfully, apparently, deflecting pressure from Russia to participate in the conflict and otherwise help them more in the conflict suggests to me that Belarus is not in any real danger of being, forcibly unified with Russia at any point in the near future. It seems pretty clear that Lukashenko is going to preserve his hold on power and will only give token concessions at this point to Russia as far as their war effort. So that said, the leaked documents themselves, not that surprising. I mean, basically it came down to the Russian government wanting to further integrate Belarus with Russia economically and politically. So economically, that just meant greater trade and whatnot, probably hard to integrate them further than what they already are. The Belarusian government is effectively already dependent on royalty payments from Gazprom that Gazprom pays out for basically transit rights. A lot of natural gas that Gazprom sent to Europe actually went through pipelines that were in Belarus. And so Gazprom paid royalties for that to the Belarusian government, and those payments were very important to the government's budget in Belarus. So already Moscow has a pretty significant amount of leverage. As far as political integration, that generally had more to do with things like interagency cooperation, officer exchanges, stuff like that, basically. And they were already doing quite a bit of that as well. I think the most interesting part of the document was cultural integration, which I think kind of betrays the Russian perspective on the matter. I think it's not just about trying to ensure that Belarus remains a Russian ally, but also that at some point Belarus could be firmly integrated back into Russia itself, and that its people would basically assimilate over the long term into Russians. And of course, that's kind of been the implicit assumption Russians have long made with regard to Belarus and also Ukraine, which is that, it's great that they're different ethnic groups, but that ultimately their destiny is basically to assimilate into a Russian identity, with perhaps maybe maintaining token residual elements of their original cultures. That's very much kind of been the historical Russian perspective among Russian nationalists. And even during the Soviet years, that was kind of the implicit attitude taken by Soviet authorities, even though the Soviet authorities kind of carved out more autonomy for Belarus and Ukrainian nationalism and independent identities. Even the Soviet government did not really have a lot of respect for those identities. And they just kind of assumed they would naturally die out over time as economic development resulted in greater education, and that education would result in greater assimilation into the dominant national identity. It's kind of like the attitude Americans take, actually, with regard to immigrants. In general, there's a nominal celebration of multiculturalism in the United States, but in practice, it's sort of expected that people will integrate into sort of the mainstream culture over time. And by and large, that happens, even amongst the progressive left in the United States, which nominally is more comfortable with multiculturalism and wants people to preserve more of their identities. Even with them, there's kind of an implicit assumption that as people assimilate, they'll assimilate into American culture as it exists already. The status quo, either conservative culture or more preferably for the progressive left American culture. There's not really any actual alternatives beyond that people would really accept. So the destiny, basically, of immigrant communities in the United States, from the perspective of most Americans, is some degree of assimilation into existing American culture. Actual tolerance for true multiculturalism is actually kind of limited, in the sense, if you actually kind of break down like what real cultural differences would look like, anything that really challenges the, what would you call it? Basically the status quo, sort of multicultural tolerance, Western liberalism in the classical sense. Mm-hmm. Anything that is in contravention of that is not really acceptable in American culture by pretty much anybody. So that actually does pretty significantly narrow the scope, for the degree to which people can actually maintain their original identities. So really assimilation within the melting pot tradition. Some elements are retained, but a lot of those elements are basically token. Things like pizza or, Chinese food. That stuff doesn't really challenge the status quo at all. So nobody really minds it if that stuff is retained. And even in those examples, they're heavily Americanized anyway, to the point where they're virtually non-recognizable to people from their original cultures.
Wait, you're saying Panda Express is not authentic Chinese cuisine?
No. No. As much has been told to me on several occasions by people from China, they do not appreciate the authenticity of Panda Express.
Would you also go out on a limb to say that Taco Bell is not authentic Mexican cuisine?
It is not.
Oh my God. Would you triple down and say for the record that Pizza Hut is not authentic Italian cuisine?
I don't think anybody thinks as much. So no, I would say it is not, in fact, authentic Italian cuisine.
Man, the hottest takes tonight.
Oh, yeah. But I'm just trying to kind of illustrate some parallels in mindset, like just in terms of assimilation over time. The Russian nationalist perspective is similar to the traditional American's perspective vis-a-vis immigration. Like it's just assumed over time that assimilation would happen. But in the Russian nationalist case, they were assuming that these ethnic identities, even though they were in sort of their original countries, would naturally dissipate over time. And in effect, that's not what happened. Maybe given more time, it would have, but whatever process was at play was obviously interrupted by the decline of the Soviet Union. And, more probably was already being disrupted just by the fact that they had their own autonomous governments. How did I get onto that? Lost my train of thought.
Belarus being taken by Russia.
Belarus, that's what it was. Right.
Yep.
So yeah, that kind of imperial mindset very much is portrayed in those documents that were released vis-a-vis, integrating Belarus with Russia. And the cultural elements within those documents were part and parcel of that. So, specifically, they were talking about, some mild things like language programs. They wanted to try to make sure that, there were lots of Russian language education opportunities in Belarus, not only for ethnic Russians, but just for the population as a whole, because they want to maximize the number of Russian speakers in the country, for obvious reasons. But I also thought it was interesting that they had elements in the plan like maximizing the number of students, in Belarus that were studying in Russia. They wanted to make sure that educational opportunities in Russia were open to Belarusian students. so that they had an opportunity to come live in, Russia, which is again Russian-speaking country, but also to be exposed to Russian culture and to otherwise be integrated into Russian culture. So, those two elements of the plan kind of suggest that they are very interested in trying to bolster Russian identification and language use specifically in Belarus. And, it's interesting because that's not really necessary to the integration of Belarus to Russia. Like, just the political and economic integration would be sufficient if all they wanted to do was tie Belarus to Russia and ensure that it did not have a foreign policy that would ever be threatening to Russia, alignment with the West or some such. But they go well beyond that, like the cultural elements of that plan and the fact that it is sort of on par with the economic and political elements of the plan really suggests that they are very interested not only in tying Belarus to Russia, but also integrating and assimilating it over time.
Mm. You said
So
that
again,
Lukashenko is smarter than he seems. What would be the
yeah,
benefit of him looking dumb?
it makes him seem less threatening, for one. Also, it makes him seem more folksy. Part of his image is as sort of a poor communal farmer. He was actually the head of a communal farm in Belarus when the Soviet Union was still around.
Hmm.
That was sort of his origin in politics. And he's always kind of played up this folksy image of himself as a farmer. So it's just kind of part of his style of politics generally. Uh, Beyond that, it also allows him to kind of play dumb whenever he's under pressure. So when the Russian government kind of comes after him and starts pressuring him to do stuff he doesn't want, he'll just kind of play dumb and say, "Oh yeah, I'll totally do that," and then he'll kind of half-ass it, and then he'll say, "Oh well, sorry, I guess I didn't understand what you wanted me to do." Yeah, the funny thing there is that the Russians are like well aware of the act, so it's almost like implicitly insulting for him to do that.
That's
Like,
really funny.
we know you're bullshitting, like, and we know you're bullshitting, but you're still doing it. So what is the point of that? And the fact that he still does that just kind of illustrates that, he's smarter than he looks. Like it's an act that he puts on purposely, but also as a kind of snub to the
Hmm.
authorities in Moscow. The popular perception in Russia of Lukashenko is more positive, but the Russian authorities actually don't really like him very much because they do recognize that he's very explicitly pushing back against Russian pressure here whenever he does stuff like that.
Putin calls for Lukashenko to help out in the Ukraine war. So Lukashenko sends 1,000 good luck cards to the Russian military.
Well, earlier on in the war, it was easier to maintain the fiction that Belarus was, no, totally, we're going to help soon,
Hmm.
but we just need more time. But they kept delaying like that, and
We're
it's
just so
again,
incompetent. We're not ready to help you yet.
oh yeah, and you can only do that so many times before it becomes readily apparent that you're just purposely finding excuses not to get involved.
Yeah. Coming
But
across
Lukashenko,
as folksy is something that we do a lot in the U.S. as well with our
oh yeah,
politicians. It's really silly too when it's very much about talking a certain way rather than actually being a certain way. If you use third grade level English and like hit the same talking points as people who are more folksy talk about, then it's really easy to kind of win their hearts and minds, even if you're just a very privileged elite. They would never suspect it.
it's smart politics. It works. People find it relatable.
Yeah. I feel like maybe Chad can get into a big debate about this, but I feel like in the US, the conservatives generally try to use that angle more often, which I don't know. I feel like that gives them a lot of leverage over people who like that kind of relatable politician to vote for. When I think of a lot of the Democratic candidates who run for president, for example, a lot of them, they just straight up talk like they're an educated elite, which is fair, and many of the Republicans are also in that same category, but it can make the people seem kind of stuffy and better than other people, which can be a turnoff.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a difficult balance to strike
Hmm.
because you don't want to be condescending,
Yeah.
right? but at the same time, there's an incentive uh, to just kind of, well, I mean, I don't want to phrase it in a way that would make myself look condescending either. You have to talk to people in a language they can understand.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you run the risk of kind of dumbing it down to the point where they feel insulted
Yeah.
or where they feel like you're dumbing it down. But at the same time, if you try to kind of engage them on an equal footing and really focus on the bigger picture, the policy, the details, for a lot of people, that's too boring. It's not relatable, and it kind of, they just kind of tune out or turn off. But also, like you say, it runs the risk of being condescending too, because they think, oh, this guy is an elitist. He's an asshole. He's purposely misconstruing and obfuscating the issue by using all of this techno babble to try to confuse me. That's a very common perspective as well.
I'm gonna let you hypnotize me with that techno babble.
Yeah. So, being able to engage people while at the same time not, while at the same time representing issues in a substantive way, that's a difficult balance to strike. Some people don't try. The Trump approach was basically just to go full populist. He just kind of ran his mouth, basically. Train of thought, almost. I mean, I don't know if you've ever, sat down and read a transcript of some of the things he said, some of his statements and speeches, but it's wild reading.
Yeah, well, I feel like the whole strat with him is it's not what he's saying, it's how he's trying to make the audience feel. And it doesn't need to connect into an overarching big picture plan that makes sense. It can just be, you said this kind of off the cuff remark that honestly, a drunk person who is passionate about something, they could just say that, and that would be very real and unfiltered. And a lot of people, I think they like when a politician can be unfiltered and they'll just say whatever, even if they get backlash for it. I think that's one of the things that Trump definitely capitalized on big time. Was we have a lot of politicians over the course of the past several decades who do kind of guard their words and make sure they say the right things, and that makes them feel like they're a different kind of person than just the random person you would run into in your own town. So yeah, saying random shit that doesn't make sense, regular people do that all the time.
Oh, yeah. I think one of the appeals of Trump was the train of thought speech style, like you say, because that is more of a conversational tone and cadence than a lot of the political speech you see from politicians.
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton is like a notorious example of political speech, right?
Yeah.
That was very much targeted, calculated speech created by, poli-sci majors doing consulting, constructed out of focus groups, and data points. Like, it just felt very stilted and artificial.
Yeah, robotic
when
almost.
Yeah. You can almost see the beats that she was supposed to be hitting with each individual sentence. And it just felt very inauthentic, right? It's not natural speech like what you get with Trump. Like, you knew he was pretty well talking stream of consciousness just from his own, I don't want to say heart per se, but
yeah, because no one could
it
have
was
read
him. Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
looked at it
Oh,
and
no,
said, yes, this is ready now. This is your speech, sir? Wait, really? It is.
No, I don't think anybody could write. I don't think AI could write that. It's a little too disjointed. Like, it really is authentic speech.
Quick, someone needs to go make an AI bot that does that. The stream of consciousness bullshit bot. It can be built.
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that. I don't know. I mean, the stilted style of politics is not very attractive, but one of its advantages is that it is, by design, intended to appeal to the maximum number of people. So, if you do have a diverse coalition of people you're trying to get together and vote for a single candidate, it's better to have targeted, constructed speeches that can try to appeal to the maximum number of people. Stream of consciousness, that can appeal a lot to people, but it generally appeals to a relatively narrow slice of the population. One of the innate advantages the Republican Party has in the US is that their governing coalition, the coalition of groups that comprise the party, are generally more homogenous across, ideological beliefs than the Democratic coalition, which is much more diverse. Not diverse just in the sense of like ethnically or racially, but diverse in terms of ideology. So that inherently makes it more difficult for Democrats to kind of rally the base. Whenever they give speeches or try to build a campaign platform, it's inherently more difficult because they're appealing to people who are not necessarily natural allies. Whereas with Republicans, it's much easier. So, if you do have somebody like Trump just that just gives a rambling speech, that is just a stream of consciousness, it's actually harder to piss off people in the coalition doing that just because they're already more homogenous. Somebody like AOC, for example, Cortez, the progressive politician from New York, if she did the stream of consciousness speech, she would probably say a lot of things that were really exciting and appealing to the progressive left part of the Democrat coalition. But there's a decent chance she would say some things that would probably alienate other parts of it. The probability of Trump alienating parts of his coalition doing something similar, much lower. So inherently, it's a strategy that's more impactful and effective for Republican candidates than Democratic candidates, which is why Democrats don't really do it as much.
Yeah, I feel like Bernie Sanders was the closest that we've had in terms of like talking a big game and having a lot of like big goals that honestly are probably not that attainable given like you have contested Congress and that kind of thing. But it would be nice to have them for people on the left and their vision of America. And that's always a really interesting balance to strike as a politician, is knowing what your constituents want and then knowing what is realistic for you to actually attain during your leadership period, which is way less than what they would really dream about in terms of their like ideal hero candidate. We'll see who they field for the next round. Maybe.
Actually, we kind of already know.
Do you think they're going to send in more old people to be voted on?
Oh, yeah.
Super
Because
old?
it's looking more and more like Biden is going to run again.
What?
Yeah. Yeah. He's kind of feeling his oats. Not so good in 2021. Afghanistan was a black eye, but Ukraine has gone relatively well for him. He's been pretty successful in passing legislation. I'd say overall my impression of him was pretty correct. I kind of thought he would be a very boring vanilla politician while in office, but that he would low-key actually be very savvy. Just being an experienced operator, I expected him to be better at getting his agenda passed and at otherwise navigating Washington politics than, say, somebody like Obama or George W. Bush or certainly Trump, all of whom were relatively inexperienced with Washington politics. So overall, that's been a pretty accurate read. He hasn't really done a lot that's very dramatic, but what he has tried to do, he's actually been pretty successful at. He's actually been very good about maneuvering through the different, factions and whatnot within his own party, as well as in negotiations with the Republican Party. So I think successes in that vein have kind of led him to feel like he's got a shot. Also, the midterm elections in 2022 also went pretty well for the Democrats, more so than expected. So I think that was also a shot in his arm. So yeah, it's looking, it's not entirely certain. It's not set in stone yet, but it's looking relatively likely that Biden will run again in the next presidential election.
If he won, would he be the oldest president we've ever had?
Oh yeah, easily. He's definitely way up there.
Is he already the oldest president we've had?
I think he might be, yeah.
Wow.
It's up there with Reagan.
Reagan was that old when he was president?
Pretty close, especially by the end.
Dude's a dinosaur. Yeah, that's the issue with political power is it takes a long time to climb, basically. It's not really a young man or young woman's sport.
Yeah. Reagan was 77, according to Google,
When he got elected?
by the end of his term.
Oh, gotcha.
And Joe Biden is currently 80. So, yeah, he should be the oldest.
Wow.
Be even older if he wins the second term.
Mm-hmm.
And the Republicans are probably going to see. It's hard to say. I mean, there was a lot more expectation that Trump would run again before the midterm election. Since then, a little less sure. He said that he will, but he's also kind of been not nearly as committed thus far to his campaign than he was in the last go around. Kind of feels like he's half-assing it a little bit. Although East Palestine was definitely a nice move. I think the Biden administration has been very slow in responding to that. It would definitely would have done them good to be more proactive about visibly recognizing the disaster and being more on the ground. But damage done for them at this point. So that's definitely a point in Trump's favor. But that said, Trump also has a lot more challengers this time. Nikki Haley actually is the first candidate other than Trump to announce that she's going to run for the Republican nomination for president. I don't think she faces very good odds. I think the strongest challenger is Ron DeSantis. And he has not, I don't think, yet announced that he's going to run, but I think everybody just kind of assumes he will.
Mm-hmm.
So if anybody has a chance of beating Trump at this point, it seems probable that it's going to be DeSantis. I guess I can't rule out Haley entirely, but, I don't think anybody takes her run all that seriously at this point. Anything can happen in politics, but, we'll see. The odds are not really in her favor at this point. But the fact that she's running at all really suggests that Trump's brand has been damaged by the midterm elections. I don't think if the Republicans had done stronger, certainly if Trump's brand had done stronger, that she would have even considered it. But at this point, there's kind of blood in the water, so there's more challengers popping up correspondingly. But it is hypothetically possible that we will see a Trump v. Biden rerun in the next presidential election.
Jeez Louise.
Yeah. Well, we got to relive and relitigate the 60s, Neuro. It's not over yet.
Why?
Because it's important, apparently. All of the 60s culture wars have to be relitigated until all of the boomers are dead.
Man.
That much I know. That is a hard cardinal rule in American politics at this point.
We haven't settled it yet.
They most likely never will, but they're going to keep trying. It'll be interesting to see what a post-boomer American politics would look like.
Mm-hmm.
I really could not tell you.
Yeah, because the boomers basically have political control right now.
Yeah, but not just directly. It's also just in terms of the political discourse and a lot of political issues.
Mm-hmm.
The culture wars in the 60s really set the pace and tone for American politics afterwards. A lot of those culture wars are still very relevant even up till today.
Mm-hmm.
People in the 60s weren't really arguing about, trans rights per se, or say gay marriage rights or, stuff like that. That kind of became more the norm later. But the style of politics in the 60s, vis-a-vis progressive left politics in particular, very much set the foundation for those things. So that'll probably continue even after the boomers, but it may change. It's not guaranteed that that will continue to be a mainstay in American politics. It may be that there's some new cultural force or change that creates a new zeitgeist, and that could look radically different from what we have now.
We're going to have
But
something new to argue about. Let's go.
You're doing okay on time?
Yeah.
I know you're feeling kind of sick and tired, so you mentioned that we might go a little short this time.
Yeah, let's say we do another hour.
Okay. Yeah, you don't have to push yourself on my account. I don't want you to kind of suffer unnecessarily here.
All good.
Let's see. We talked about Ukraine, China. I think somebody. I don't. Oh, I should do the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. More painfully obvious at sometimes than others. So if I ever say anything that's wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me if I'm wrong. I want to know more than anybody, and I do get a lot out of feedback from chat. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later, so I will see it eventually. So participation in chat is encouraged in that regard. But that said, normally 99% of the time I don't read chat, but I did kind of breeze past it while I was alt tabbing. I think somebody was asking about what was it? A question about McCarthy or something.
Yeah, McCarthy era.
Yeah, is Trump a new McCarthy era or something like that?
What does that mean?
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, are you familiar with the McCarthy era?
Maybe not.
McCarthyism, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or the House Committee for Un-American Activities. That was when they had people were called before the committee and they were asked if they had ever been a communist or if they knew anybody who was a communist. And a bunch of people in Hollywood ended up getting blacklisted because they had been fingered by people as communists, that era. Basically, that was the McCarthyism and the McCarthy era. So I don't think we're anywhere near something like that right now. I've seen some people make the argument that, progressive left style politics online has reached a point where it kind of goes after people and ruins them because of associations with certain conservative ideas or ideology that are seen as harmful. So I don't think, though, I mean, there's some truth to that, but I don't think it's at all comparable to McCarthyism at this point. McCarthyism had the full backing of the US government and was led by congressmen, specifically Senator McCarthy himself. And, we had a whole last House committee dedicated to it, so that's a whole degree apart, from what we have now as far as activism online that goes after people, that is more of a community effort. That's more like what used to happen only at the level of a small town. It used to be if somebody in a small town did something that was very uncouth or breached some kind of norm, then they would be ostracized or maybe even driven out of town, in an extreme case. So with the internet, we've basically shrunk the public space such that small town style ostracizing is now possible at a national level, which is not really great. A lot of people hate small town life, specifically for that reason. But it is a community effort, right? It's purely private sector in nature. It's not something that the government itself is pushing.
Cancel
So in that
culture.
sense, cancel culture is what people have come to call it. But in that sense, it's qualitatively different than McCarthyism.
Yeah,
But
because it's McCarthyism. It seems like was more rooted in one particular type of accusation, whereas the online, I don't know, banishment of people who have done something bad. It can be all kinds of stuff from like sexual abuse to involvement in hate groups to things like that.
yeah,
It's not just one thing.
yeah, and it was also implicitly assumed back in the 50s that that communist parties anywhere on Earth were basically just de facto directly controlled by the Soviet Union. So there was this element of foreignness to the House Un-American Activities investigations and accusations of communism. It wasn't just about an uncouth ideology that people didn't like. Implicit in the accusation of communism was that you were a de facto agent for a totalitarian foreign power that was seeking to undermine, if not destroy, the United States. So that element also is missing in the present circumstances. But beyond cancel culture and the progressive left, I don't think you could look at Trump or the alt-right or whatever kind of right-wing equivalent that you could point to constitutes McCarthyism at this point. Certainly they have been very active in going after people who are engaged in things like trans activism. There's definitely been a peculiar obsession with pedophilia. Uh, I guess with Epstein, some of that could be justified, but it's kind of turned into more of a tool, well, not even a tool, a political bludgeon to use against political opponents at this juncture.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that constitutes McCarthyism either. That's more just populism. And the United States has a long history of that, going all the way back to, the founding of the country. So I wouldn't call that McCarthyism either. Again, I think McCarthyism really is a distinctive, unique era in American history that is not going to be easy to replicate. If you just want to use McCarthyism as a kind of metaphor for just general ostracizing and people ganging up on others that have unpopular opinions, definitely there are parallels to that in the present day. But there's always been parallels to that all throughout American history.
Mm-hmm.
There's always been periods when people just really crack down on unpopular opinions and the people who hold them, often extending into the physically violent. So I don't think McCarthyism is unusual in that sense. A useful metaphor, perhaps, but it's imprecise.
I think Fuzzy Core did pass along the other questions in Discord.
Okay. Thank you, Fuzzy Cord. Let's see. Any potential that Russia tries to initiate operations in Belarus, Transnistria without fully resolving the Ukraine conflict? Also, any news on the ascension of Finland, Sweden to NATO? Well, operations in Belarus are more likely just because they already have a border, but I don't think that the Russian army is in much position to do anything too dramatic. I think Lukashenko, again, is probably going to be able to outmaneuver them. With Moldova, I think it's especially unlikely that they try anything because Moldova is far away from Russia. It's literally between a NATO member state and Ukraine. And it is, I believe, landlocked, so it cannot be accessed via the Black Sea either. So that doesn't really leave a lot of options as far as directly sending Russian troops there. There are already some Russian troops there, Russian peacekeepers, quote unquote, who are sitting in the Transnistria Republic, but there's not nearly enough of them to really do anything substantive. They could not, I don't think, overthrow Moldova's government. And if they tried, probably there would be some degree of Western intervention of some kind, especially if the Russians tried to use some kind of gray warfare bullshit like they did in Crimea back in the day with the little green men. If the Russians tried to prop up separatists in Transnistria with the Russian troops and tried to pretend like the Russian troops were actually locals, the West may, take that as an opportunity to intervene more than they would otherwise. Because, if there's no Russian troops present, then what's the danger in intervening?
Mm-hmm.
So we wouldn't have to care in that case. But even if Russian troops were explicitly involved in an attempt to overthrow Moldova's government, I think the Western response would still be pretty strong. Certainly the Moldovan response would be pretty strong. So I don't think it's really a viable path forward for Russia to initiate any kind of actual military operations against Moldova or Belarus. But if by operations you mean something more clandestine, then yeah, that's much more feasible. That would not require any kind of troops or other kind of conventional military forces, which are otherwise tied down right now in Ukraine. But something like a coup attempt, something with mercenaries, stuff like that, they could do. And they're probably thinking about it. The Moldovan government is convinced they're thinking about it with regard to their own circumstances. And it would not surprise me in the least if they had at least considered it vis-a-vis Lukashenko and Belarus. But as far as the potential for them actually following through, I don't know. I mean, the Russian government has been doing some crazy, unpredictable shit lately, so I don't really feel like I or anybody else is in much position to really determine how likely it is that they do this, that, or the other. I would be inclined to think that it's unlikely, just because it's relatively high risk for relatively low reward. I mean, if they actually did try to overthrow Lukashenko and failed, what impact would that have on relations? Pretty negative, right? You probably that would push Lukashenko over more towards a Western orientation, with correspondingly negative repercussions for Russia's strategic position in Ukraine. So, yeah, I have to think that's pretty unlikely. And even if they succeeded in overthrowing Lukashenko, like, then what? I mean, at that point, you've pissed off and alienated the lead patronage network in Belarus, which encompasses, the army, well, the military generally, as well as the power elite in Belarus. So it's not inconceivable at that point that the West could try to organize some kind of alliance between dissident forces outside of Belarus in conjunction with the patronage network that was ousted. And that would be a pretty powerful force. They would have the legitimacy of the protesters combined with the resources and connections of the patronage network. And that could definitely cause a lot of trouble for any potential occupation government that was de facto set up. So yeah, that's not a great outcome either. So I don't think it's a very attractive proposition for Moscow overall. But they've been doing some dumb shit. They've been miscalculating left and right in their foreign policy over the past couple of years. So, their ability to really assess risk seems to be in question at this juncture. And we talked about this before last week with the meth head with the knife analogy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like in general, you would like to think they were rational actors and could assess risk, rationally, but it doesn't seem like they've been able to do that lately. So if we can't assume they're rational actors, then it's not really possible to assess one way or the other how likely it is that they would stage some kind of coup attempt in Belarus or Moldova. So in that sense, the answer is I don't know how likely it is. So I'm not in a position to judge. But I would add, in my own defense, nobody's in a position to judge that. Nobody knows. It's just a big question mark. It is an open area of concern at this point. As far as news on Finland and Sweden, yeah, there's been some developments there, but it's back and forth. There was a far-right politician who asked for permission. This is in Sweden, by the way. This is a far-right politician in Sweden who asked for permission to hold a rally or a protest or whatever. And the Swedish government gave it to him. And at the rally, he burned a Koran because he was not very happy about immigrants or Turkey or just any of it. And of course, this very much upset the Turkish government. And in retaliation, they canceled scheduled talks that were to be held that were intended to try to smooth out differences over Turkish opposition to Swedish accession to NATO, which they had been stonewalling all for some time. Nominally, it had been stonewalling because of Swedish support, as they call it, for the PKK. Support in their case basically being allowing Kurdish refugees into Sweden, some of whom had former ties to the PKK. The Turks had been asking for those specific Kurds to be, extradited to Turkey, which the Swedish government did not want to do, since they were not only refugees but also asylum seekers who had been, successfully granted asylum. So the Swedish government kind of balked at that, and the result was a standoff, and eventually they agreed to some concessions, for example, expelling some refugees that had had ties with PKK, and nominally agreeing to extradition. I don't think anything actually came of that, though. But regardless, those concessions had nominally led to a break in the deadlock, and it seemed like things were moving forward. But then the incident with the Koran burning happened, and Turkey basically pulled out of talks, and they're kind of back to being deadlocked. So it's not clear what's going to happen there. There was some talk after the Koran burning incident that Finland might go ahead with NATO accession without Sweden. Turkey was not really upset with Finland after the incident in question. Obviously, they were mostly focused on Sweden. So there was room open for Finland, perhaps, to progress without Sweden. And there was one Finnish politician who suggested that could happen, but that was pretty quickly followed up with statements from other Finnish politicians and government officials that that would not happen. And given how closely tied Finland is to Sweden in terms of security cooperation, it seems pretty unlikely that one would accede to NATO well ahead of the other. It seems like they're going to try to move in lockstep as much as possible.
Why?
Because their security is inherently intertwined. They're both pretty small countries, but also neighboring countries. So the security of one inherently is linked up to the other. If something were to happen to Finland, then that would mean, like if Finland were invaded or were otherwise subjugated, that would create a threat on the Swedish border in the northeast. So the Swedes don't want that. So as a result, they have coordinated pretty consistently over the past half century, if not even, before then, on security matters. Given that the security of one inherently impacts the security of the other. There was actually even a time in the years immediately after World War II, in which there was serious talk about creating a kind of Scandinavian defense treaty alliance that would have encompassed Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland. And that was seen as a necessary step in order to defend against potential aggression from the Soviet Union. And it was also seen as a preferable alternative to a security alliance with the United States and other Western powers. In general, the preference of Scandinavian nations had been to maintain neutrality, but it was thought that was not really feasible without a stronger deterrent in the form of a larger Scandinavian defense grouping, given how large the threat was posed by the Soviet Union. That defense treaty ended up not happening, in part because of Soviet and Western pressure. The Soviets were kind of leaning on the Finns to have a more compliant foreign policy that was geared more towards Soviet foreign policy preferences. And the Finns ultimately did not feel they could kind of deny that pressure fully, the result being Finland's unique position as a Finlandized state during the Cold War. And Western pressure came in the form of American pressure on Iceland, Denmark, and Norway. The US did not really have confidence that a Scandinavian defense grouping would actually be able to deter a Soviet attack. And also there was concern that the Soviets might be able to, in the event of, say, a Soviet-sponsored revolution in, say, Norway or Denmark, or perhaps in the event of a successful Soviet invasion, that the Swedes and Danes would be able to prevent the Soviets from gaining access to ports on their coast, which was a big deal for the United States because that would have given the Soviets warm water ports on the Atlantic, which was something that they very much wanted to stop, if at all possible. Iceland for a similar reason. They wanted not only for Iceland not to fall into Soviet hands one way or the other, and for the Soviets in turn to gain access to Atlantic ports in Iceland, but they also wanted to use Iceland as a kind of waypoint. Iceland had been important during World War II as a center for anti-submarine warfare. Aircraft and ships had been based in Iceland that participated in the effort in the Battle of the Atlantic, basically in the effort to try to subjugate German U-boats. So it was assumed that if there were a prospect of World War III, that Iceland would fulfill a similar role. So the United States wanted to try to secure Iceland as a member of the alliance, in part to ensure that Icelandic territory, that access to Icelandic territory was available for that potential war effort. So all told, the United States pressured all three countries, and ultimately they were successful in pressuring them. The main point of pressure was actually financial aid. The United States was giving them money to help them with reconstruction after the war. And ultimately, the prospect of being cut off from that aid was pretty much sufficient to lead them to ultimately abandon talks to form a Scandinavian defense organization and to eventually agree to join NATO. So you could say Norway, Denmark, and Iceland are very reluctant NATO members. They had not originally really wanted to join, but had effectively been strong-armed after the war into doing so. But yeah, that's all just to exemplify how regional identity and regional security has historically been paramount amongst regional actors in Scandinavia. They generally think more regionally in terms of their security. And even Sweden, even after Finland had been Finlandized and the Scandinavian organization had been scrapped, had failed to formulate, had failed to form, Sweden still continued to try to organize the different regional actors as far as security matters. So, Finland was obviously uh, kind of co-opted into a de facto pro-Soviet neutrality, so to speak. It was kind of an awkward arrangement, but even so, the Swedes continued to cooperate with them on defense matters, through the Cold War, in so much as was possible. And as far as NATO, Sweden was actually secretly coordinating with NATO on cooperation in the event of World War III. The Swedish government actually assumed that if World War III broke out between the West and the Soviets, that they would invariably get involved in it one way or the other. And so there were actually secret talks in order to organize cooperation between NATO forces and the Swedish military in that event. So they were not formally NATO members, but they did actually cooperate with NATO on the down low during the Cold War. So yeah, Sweden's been very proactive in its defense policy in the region over time. And so no surprise then that they would try to coordinate with their partner Finland as far as this change in the defense landscape here, not only Russian aggression, but joining NATO. It was never going to be the case that one of them joined NATO without the other. It was almost invariably going to be something that, if it happened, would happen after consultation between them, which is, of course, what happened. They did actually talk to each other beforehand and agreed that it was something that they would do together.
They want to be a team. That's cool.
Let's see. But yeah, there's not a lot of new developments there on Swedish and Finnish accession. The Turks have basically said that they're not going to vote on it until after their election. The Turkish government had said before the Koran burning incident that they would probably vote for Sweden and Swedish and Finnish accession after the election, but that's kind of in doubt right now. So we'll see what happens. It could be Washington kind of leans in and tries to pressure the Turks somehow, but the Turks kind of have some leverage at this juncture given shenanigans in the Middle East right now. So that may not happen. That remains to be seen. But yeah, the pathway forward is uncertain. Presumably they'll get in at some point. I have to think that the Turkish government under President Erdogan is sufficiently transactional that getting their support is just a matter of time and payment. But it's not clear how much time or just what kind of compensation Erdogan is really looking for here. I have to imagine that after his election, he'll be much less of a hard ass about it. I suspect a lot of the opposition thus far has actually been token and has been more about trying to make Erdogan look tough to Turkish nationalists in Turkey, who comprise the most important constituency in Turkish politics.
Yeah, so it benefits him personally to take a hard stance on this.
Yeah. Yeah, he actually even moved up the elections that were scheduled. I think they were originally going to be in like April or May or something. And well, no, actually even later than that. And I think he moved them up. No, that's what it was. He moved them up to May. That's what it was. So originally they were going to have a couple of months later after that. So he was kind of hoping that he could avoid any potential, anything that might happen between now and the election date, would create problems for him. So he'd hope by moving up the date, he could minimize the possibility of random shit happening that might make him unpopular. Didn't work. I'm sure everybody is aware by now of the earthquakes that hit southeastern Turkey.
Yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah, yeah. So the fact that that happened has actually kind of blown up in his face as far as moving up the elections, because now the earthquake and the drama of the earthquake and the government's somewhat haphazard response to the earthquake, all of that is going to be much fresher to people's minds in a May election than it would in an election that might have happened later in the year.
Mm-hmm.
So that ended up being a political miscalculation on his part.
Yeah, it's hard to account for like natural catastrophes, though.
Yeah. Yeah, the world's random event generator is inherently unpredictable.
Yep.
Let's see. What happened to Russian alternative to internet? Did the project fail? I didn't know they were trying to set one up. I knew that they were going out of their way to try to increase government control over the internet and people's access to the internet, as well as connectivity between the internet in Russia and the internet outside of Russia. You know, they've been setting up mechanisms at key choke points in the network, specifically, I think, routers that connected Russia to the outside world in order that would allow them greater oversight over content and data that was passing between and outside Russia. But I don't know about, I never heard of like a full-on alternative to the internet per se. You know, just more like a China-style Great Firewall. You know, they never really fully did like a China-style Great Firewall, but they've kind of been moving in that direction. I think even now they don't really have the capacity to really cut off the outside world completely, at least as of yet. But I don't think the project really failed per se. I think they're just they're not. Again, I don't think they're developing another internet. If I'm wrong, let me know, because that would definitely be a subject I'd be interested in. But as far as I know, they haven't been trying to do that, and so the focus has been much more on just censorship, more
Wouldn't
so than just.
wouldn't that take another totally separate set of cables if it was a totally separate
Well,
internet?
not necessarily cables. You know, you could do it just by controlling the routers, basically. You know, if you could control all of the choke points by which data moves into Russia, then hypothetically you could just shut off the routers and block them off, or at least block any data that comes from a source that is from outside Russia. So hypothetically, they could do that if they could control all those choke points. It's difficult to control all those choke points because, you know, the internet is inherently a web, you know, by design. It was originally designed to survive a nuclear apocalypse, right? So obviously inherently difficult to disrupt it. But even if you only control a few key choke points, that could actually be enough to throttle traffic to the point where you've effectively blocked off all outside traffic.
Mm-hmm.
So not necessarily different cables, you know. I mean, hypothetically, you could set up an entirely different network infrastructure with purely proprietary routers, cables, etc. But that would require an immense investment, like the amount of technology and new equipment that you would have to build would just range in the hundreds of billions of dollars probably. So even getting to a point where you could do that would be extraordinarily difficult.
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe it could be easier if you could find like an outside industrial base that could kind of build some of that for you. You know, hypothetically, China might do that, but I don't think China's even interested in doing something that dramatic. You know, it's just a lot more cost efficient to just focus on throttling traffic or otherwise censoring traffic. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think they were ever developing a full-on alternative to the internet. Let's see, would DeSantis and Trump running against each other damage each other's chances like Hillary Sanders? Yeah, but no more than usual. I mean, it's always the case that rivals attacking each other in primaries kind of undermines them a bit in the subsequent general election. So I don't think Trump and DeSantis going at each other would put them at any more of a disadvantage in that regard than other politicians. So I would discount that as a factor. And I would point out that it kind of impacts everybody equally anyway, because both Democrats and Republicans coming out of the primary process invariably are damaged by that factor. And I don't know that it necessarily damages one more than the other overall, unless there's just something really dramatic that comes out in the process. But I imagine if there was something that dramatic, then probably the candidate targeted would end up losing the primary. It would end up dropping out in the primary process.
Who will sling the nastier dirt at the other?
Yeah.
We have a very serious question. Dear Agent Smith, if I buy Stellaris, can I be a race of brain-sucking octopus aliens?
You can definitely be octopus aliens. Brain sucking, Maybe. How do you want to define brain sucking here?
I would guess that you, yeah, I guess you just RP that. You say that you kill them and eat their brain or something.
Yeah, so here's the thing. You actually can do that. It's not so much the brain sucking per se, but if you want to define brain sucking in terms of something like a vampiric race that depends for sustenance on the consumption of other races,
Mm-hmm.
you actually can play races like that. In fact, there's not a specific race you can use. It's actually a type that you can use. So you can actually create a custom race that has this as an outright attribute. Yeah, I think it's called necro something, necrophilia, or not necrophilia. That's something else. I forget what the trait is called, but it's necro something. So basically, you can actually subsist on the consumption of other races. Basically, you're space vampires.
Space octopus vampires.
Yeah, so you can just design a race that is octopi in nature,
Mm-hmm.
which is just basically pick when you're picking your racial type or
Mm-hmm.
species type, just pick an aquatic type, and you'll get an option of different portraits, basically, different designs that your species can look like, and you can pick the one that looks like an octopus. So there you go. At that point, you have your octopi race.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you're picking traits, then just pick the necro trait, whatever it's called. And then you'll have your quote unquote brain sucking aliens, brain sucking octopi aliens.
Wow. A lot of customization.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's a lot of fun. Yeah. I'm still playing through my playthrough as the doomed planet aquatic type.
Mm.
Yeah. Aquatic type is also not just a species type. It can also be a trait. And it gives you extra bonuses and penalties with regard to ocean worlds. It's pretty neat.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm very much in the late game of that playthrough though, which can be a little boring. It's kind of you're kind of on rails a little bit. You kind of know where things are going. Nothing really challenges you per se, unless by the late game you're like a medium-sized civ, in which case there's always some degree of threat and drama. But I'm relatively powerful at this point, so I'm not too worried. I breezed through the Great Khan mid-game crisis with ease. This is probably the easiest I've handled the Great Khan crisis.
Why was that easy?
Oh, I had two very large fleets, and then I also had a mercenary fleet, which was just massive. I've never seen a mercenary fleet that big. I did not build it. It was the mercenary station in question was originally in a rival power's territory.
Mm-hmm.
But then I just obliterated them, and it ended up in my territory. But by then, they'd already boosted it significantly,
Ah.
and I actually maxed it out. What you can do is you can pay the mercenary station to increase the size of the mercenary fleet they have
Mm-hmm.
available for payment, and you can just pay them to have access to it. It comes under your control if you can afford it. And yeah, they basically just maxed them out almost. So they had a huge fleet available, and so when the Great Khan crisis started, I just bought the fleet.
Mm-hmm.
So that combined with my regular fleet was just so large that I basically just steamrolled them. Like
Nice.
I didn't even have to defeat the Great Khan's fleet before I invaded their core territory. I literally just breezed right in to the three core systems that had been part of their core territory before the event. And normally that's not something you can do easily because those are very heavily defended. But I just had such a massive fleet that I just rolled into them just easily.
Nice.
Yeah, so I'm not in any real danger at this point, and I don't know well, I mean, I don't know what kind of late game crisis I'm going to draw because that's random, but I don't think anything can happen at this point which will be too much of a problem. Knock on wood.
Unless it's the mercenaries turn against you crisis.
I, Technically, that would be possible if another Civ bought them from me, but I think because they're in my territory, I could actually prevent that, or at least I could force them to end the contract early.
Mm.
So I should be okay even in that case. Yeah, at this point, it's just more role playing and personal objectives.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to set up a couple of vassals. Like there's a system next to a vassal I have that only controls one system. and I'm trying to develop it for them. It's got 2 planets. I'm trying to terraform the planets into something that they'll find useful. And I'm also building a station in the system. So they'll have 3 colonizable planets, quote unquote, to settle. And I'm going to give it to them after I kind of get it ready. So they'll be a relatively powerful vassal, at least as far as small vassals go, once I do that. No particular reason to do it. I just thought it was fun, wanted to do it. I'm also thinking about vassalizing some other empires, but I don't know if that's going to be really feasible. So I'm kind of trying to game out how I might do that. Yeah, there's just a lot of little things you can do that kind of keep you interested in a given game, even past the point where you're not really assailable. Although it's always possible that you could become assailable. Some of those late game crises are real ball busters. So even given what I've got going right now, it could be that I just get crushed. Yeah, late game crises are inherently difficult by design, even if you're in a strong position. So we'll see. But hey, even if I can manage it easily, I can just make fun for myself by invading one of the advanced civs. There's one advanced civ in particular in this playthrough that has been an absolute asshole to me the entire game. So invading them, if I could get powerful enough, is actually quite attractive. Yeah, one of the starting positions that you can have is actually called Scion. And so a civilization that has that as their starting, origin, basically, has a special relationship with advanced civs. And the neighboring rival empire that I basically have been at war with, had been at war with almost the entire game, had a Scion relationship with an advanced civ. So the advanced civ did not go to war with me whenever I went to war with the Scion civ, but they did put sanctions on me every time it happened. And they put some pretty nasty penalties on me, which was very aggravating because there wasn't anything I could do about it. Even if I was just claiming a system, they would put sanctions on me. So I very much look forward to wrecking their shit eventually, if possible, just as revenge,
Make
if
a
nothing else.
spaceport, put sanctions on you. Research a new technology, they put sanctions on you.
Yeah, it's been a pain in the ass. But yeah, whatever you want to do in Stellaris, you can pretty well do. Yeah, and they're still adding content. Their business model is to add little things like story packs and and also periodic just adjustments to the core game mechanics in order to keep people interested. So, the longer the game goes along, the more sophisticated and the more options, the more sophisticated it gets and the more options for different play styles and role-playing opportunities that you have. So it only ever really gets better, in other words. Yeah, very cool. Basically a sandbox.
Nice.
Let's see, we have one other question here. How reliable is the EU as a defensive organization? If I remember correctly, there are some security language in the EU Charter. There is. Technically, EU member states are obligated to defend each other in the event one of them comes under attack. In practice, it's a pretty meaningless commitment. Because really, the guarantor of European security is the United States, and specifically by way of NATO. So yes, the European Union does technically have an obligation, well, member states of the European Union technically do have an obligation to defend each other, but most of them do not have the capacity to really do that. The security strategy for most countries in Europe is to hope that the United States saves them if something happens. And that's about the extent of it. So that being the case, even if the United States did not come to their aid, their fellow European Union member states would not really be in a good position to do much about it. Maybe the UK is not a member state anymore, but maybe France might be able in a position to do something. France probably has the largest and best ability to project force outside its borders, but that's about it. And even France has relatively limited capacity. Everybody else has very limited force projection abilities. Even for a country that's in Europe and that's relatively close by, they would probably have relative difficulty projecting force into it such that they could help them with any potential invasion or revolution or some such. If you want an example of what I'm talking about, you can look at Bosnia. During the Yugoslav wars back in the 90s, Europeans were very interested in trying to do something to help Bosnia and end the fighting. And the United States basically did not give a shit. So at first, it was very much a European operation, but very quickly it became apparent that the Europeans did not have the capacity to project force into Bosnia sufficiently to set up any kind of substantive peacekeeping operations, certainly not to help out, say, the Croats in Operation Typhoon to throw back the Serbs and change facts on the ground such that peace became more desirable. In order to do that, they depended on the United States, whom they drew in over time, basically begging us to come and deal with the problem. So, European capacities have improved since then, but not really sufficiently to the point where European Union security commitments are going to be sufficient to really protect countries in Europe. It's still the case that NATO is the main security guarantor of security in Europe, and by extension, the United States. So long story short, no, the European Union is not reliable as a defensive organization. I would add that the European Union lacks the coordinated command structure of NATO. NATO's been preparing for a collective war in which the armies of Europe and North America would fight together, and they've created a coordinated command structure that would command all the different armies that would be involved. And the different armies in NATO have also, worked together over time to try to reduce potential frictions that might emerge. Things like different standards, different practices, different leadership styles, what have you. There's been a push over decades to try to homogenize different NATO member state militaries in order to ensure that it would be easy in the event of war for them to all work together. So, all of that creates a lot of strong institutions, basically, that are NATO specific, that give NATO a big advantage over the EU, which lacks similar institutions. If you wanted to have like an EU equivalent, you would have to start building new institutions that would basically replicate what already exists in NATO. And the fact that there would be replication has actually been one of the reasons that the EU has not done that. There's no reason to duplicate what already exists.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the French government argues, actually, yes, they should duplicate those institutions, because then they could have a defense institution or a set of defense institutions separate from the United States. And the French over time have been very much about trying to make Europe strategically independent from the United States, or at least relatively more independent. And they've also been all about trying to build European-specific defense institutions that not only exclude the United States, but also act as a kind of avatar for French foreign policy and French ambitions to lead Europe. Those efforts have kind of not gone anywhere over time. They've never really stopped trying, but French efforts to kind of build those European-specific institutions have not met with a positive response in the rest of Europe, with the result that there's not really been much traction there. Let's see, I think that's all the questions we had. I think, how much time did we have?
I'm good to go for another like 10 to 15.
Okay, so we're kind of in the wrapping up stage then.
Yeah.
There's still drama in Israel. It's potentially spinning out into a constitutional crisis at this point. I had more extensive notes about it, but long story short, the Israeli government is trying to remove the judiciary's ability to practice what we in the United States would call judicial review, which is where in the United States case, it's the Supreme Court. So judicial review is where the Supreme Court in the United States would strike down a law for being unconstitutional. So Israel does not quite have a Supreme Court, but they do have an equivalent. And the Israeli government right now is trying to take away their ability they're de facto taking away their ability to strike down legislation. Actually, if the reform goes through, the Supreme Court of Israel's, or the equivalent therein, uh, would still be able to strike down legislation that was thought to be unconstitutional. But the caveat is that if the reforms go through, the government could overturn the Supreme Court's overturning with just a majority vote. So, in effect, the Supreme Court of Israel would be neutered. They would effectively not be able to prevent the government from imposing laws that are explicitly illegal, given the Israeli Constitution. So that has people pretty upset for obvious reasons. But here's the issue. What could happen is that the Israeli government passes the laws, fully, but then the Israeli Supreme Court strikes down those laws as unconstitutional. But then the Israeli government could then ignore that, citing the laws that were passed. And at that point, you would have a constitutional crisis because it's not clear how that would be resolved. So exciting times in Israel. There's been mass protests. There's been talk about, the Israeli government becoming a liberal democracy or even authoritarian. And all of this is happening on top of an escalation of violence in Palestine and among Palestinians, even in Israel itself. So the Middle East is always a pretty happening place, but normally Israel is not really the focal point, at least not Israel itself. Obviously, Palestine is a running issue, but normally politics in Israel itself are something resembling normal, something that would pass for normal in, say, Europe or North America. Mm-hmm. That is not the case right now. This is definitely a dramatic point in the history of Israeli politics, and it bears watching. Let's see. Oh, I did have some stupid shit. I guess this would be the time for it.
Let's go.
Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, we talked about the Filipino jails last time.
Jacuzzi jail, yep.
What did I do with it? Oh, that's right. It was Spain. Spain had I think it was a transportation minister. Oh, here it is. Yeah, top Spanish transport officials ended up having to resign because they had ordered some commuter trains that ended up being too big for tunnels in two specific regions. Seems like something that would be pretty avoidable, but they managed to screw it up. So they've had to resign correspondingly.
It's a pretty silly mistake.
Yeah.
That can happen. We're going to make the biggest, best train we've ever had here. All right. So, can it fit through that tunnel over there? Oh, crap.
So a bit of a goof over there in Spain. Let's see. They also had, I don't know if this really counts as stupid per se, but it's pronounced Hyundai, right? The Korean car company?
Yeah, Hyundai.
Hyundai, okay. So Hyundai actually got in trouble here in the United States because one of their auto plants in, I think, Alabama was found to be using child labor as young as kids as young as 12 years old.
Damn.
Pretty interesting story. Normally child labor stories like that you expect to see in the developing world, but apparently in the United States now. Maybe not so surprising given that it's Alabama. Alabama is not too far removed from developing status in some ways, but still not something you expect to hear about within the actual United States.
Damn.
Let's see. I guess that's the main. I could have sworn there was some other item, but I guess that was it.
What if instead of the US doing a show of force by driving through the Taiwan Strait, what if we just sent like a shitload of weather balloons at them?
I think they would be bemused. put it mildly. Although, if that were explicitly the alternative to a freedom of navigation operation through the Taiwan Strait, I think they would actually like that a lot. I think they would find that much preferable.
That's what they call it, a freedom of navigation.
Yeah,
Whatever.
we do those in the South China Sea normally. Well, I say we, but the United States Navy. The South China Sea is disputed territory. The United States tries to back the claims of allied nations like the Philippines in the region. And so, in order to kind of contest Chinese ownership or Chinese, proclaimed ownership over the South China Sea, the United States Navy will sometimes sail a couple ships or a battle group or what have you through the South China Sea, explicitly through territory claimed by China. And yeah, those are called freedom of navigation operations. Because, we don't recognize the Chinese claim. We believe it's international waters. And so if it is international waters, we should be able to navigate freely through them.
Mm-hmm.
So we're just establishing we're establishing and reinforcing and asserting our position on the matter by engaging in those operations.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. Navy does not believe it's doing anything illegal. China disagrees, but they also don't want to start a war over it.
Boldly driving a boat in areas which upset people.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. There's a lot of passive aggressive bullshit like that in international diplomacy. It's kind of the sine qua non of aggressive diplomacy, rather. Well, did we have any other items or questions or anything we wanted to get to here?
I think we're in a pretty good spot. I may give my voice a rest, but thank you for coming on and saying words so I could just play some games and listen to the dulcet tones of Agent Smith keeping us all up to date. As a reminder, if we messed anything up for this segment, let us know in the YouTube comments. Feel free to give us a scathing review. We're really happy to know about the type of bias that we represent, and also if any articles or whatever we passed along were not good, just let us know. And then if you have any firsthand accounts of where you're from, if we talked about your country and what's going on, your perspective is probably more valid than ours, so feel free to share.
Yeah, we always love hearing from primary sources.
Yeah. And thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for handling questions for us today, and Chant for providing a lovely, stimulating conversation.
Yeah, always appreciated.
Heck yeah, and we will see you all in the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
Nice.